Good morning. Today I want to wrap up the Vietnam War for you guys. So I'm going to go over a couple things that we didn't go over last time in our notes. You may have gone over it in some activities this week. So let's talk about where we left off. Last week when I gave you guys notes, we took those notes all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And if you remember, the resolution gave Johnson pretty much unlimited powers in Vietnam. And in 1965, Johnson deploys 50,000 Marines to Da Nang. And by 1968, we're going to see over 500,000 troops deployed to Vietnam. And we'll talk a little bit about the strategies in Vietnam. The war is going to become increasingly unpopular. As we commit more troops to Vietnam, a credibility gap is growing in the country where the government's telling us we're winning the war, and that is not the case. The war becomes so unpopular that President Johnson in 1968 will not seek re-election. And by 1973, there's going to be a hard push to get out of Vietnam due to the lack of popularity there. So 1968 is really considered a turning point year for a lot of reasons. We have violent protests in the streets because of the civil rights movement, because of the Vietnam War. Robert Kennedy is going to be the run as the new Democratic nominee for the Democratic Party once Johnson does not seek re-election. He is going to be assassinated by Sirhan because of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated in 1968 by James Earl Ray. Again, this is just proving that 1968 was just kind of a turning point where the American public began to have enough of Vietnam and many injustices that were in the United States at the time. So, again, let's talk about the strategies. Right. So one of the reasons the Vietnam War is so unpopular is because of these search and destroy missions that U.S. platoons are going to go on. One of the reasons is we mentioned the Viet Cong. These were the South Vietnamese supporters of the North. And it was very hard to identify who these VC or Viet Cong were. They had nicknames Charlie, Pajama People. Bottom line is they dressed in regular attire. They didn't dress in military clothes. So it was very hard to determine who they were and became very frustrating. So it wouldn't be too uncommon for a U.S. platoon, to walk into a village and with the assuming that everybody possibly could be Viet Cong, it would wind up killing a majority of the villagers. One of the reasons also why the war becomes unpopular, it's a televised war. Many Americans are watching not only the body count of troops coming home, but they're also seeing our military go into these villages, and it's very confusing to see our troops what would look like to be hurting innocent civilians. So these search and destroy missions were highly unpopular. We used napalm, Agent Orange against the enemy as well, chemical weapons, which is very, very unlawful. The North Vietnamese, they had the VC in the south, and they also used guerrilla tactics. They knew the terrain. They liked to use hand-to-hand combat, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we did to try to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiation table was we would continuously bomb the North with these high altitude bombings and cause a lot of damage. But it was farmland, and the enemy was very elusive. This was a learning curve strategy. General Westmoreland, who was in charge of our troops, believed that we would eventually get the North to the negotiation table, and this just kind of made matters worse. These aerial objectives, and they were considered to be a failure, even though Richard Nixon, once president, will try them again. So what's the turning point? Well, 1968, like I said, was considered to be a tumultuous year. In the beginning of 1968, there was supposed to be a ceasefire because of the Chinese New Year known as the Tet. All right. Well, it was agreed that from the North, there was an agreement with the North that there would be a ceasefire. And what happens is the Vietnamese North and VC launch a major attack on all the U.S. military bases in Vietnam. So these attacks were suppressed, but the Tet Offensive proves that the enemy is more tenacious than we thought, and that they weren't going to easily give up. And people were kind of realizing that the Vietnam War by 1968 was unwinnable, and that is one of the reasons why the Tet is considered to be the turning point of the war. Another thing that happens in 1968 is the My Lai massacre, when Lieutenant William Cawley marches his platoon on one of these search and destroy missions, and goes into a village and kills pretty much every villager. You know, his excuse was, again, he did not know who were VC, who were not VC. So he winds up killing innocent civilians, and this lights a lot of indignation in the country. He is court-martialed, but are going to be eventually pardoned by President Nixon. Oh, again, I'll let you read this on your own, but there's a picture of Cawley right there, and his men. Their defense was that they were just following orders. So we have a lot of anti-war protests at home. A lot of demonstrations. You have young men who could not receive a deferment status but were conscientious objectors, burning their draft cards. To receive deferment, you would have to be considered medically unsound to go into the armed forces, or if you were enrolled in college and were maintaining a C average, you could defer your draft. So Vietnam becomes more unpopular because it's considered to be a working class war. You don't see rich kids getting drafted. You don't see upper class people being called on to fight. So again, this was the cause of a lot of anger as well. The draft. 1968, President Nixon is going to be Richard Milhous Nixon is going to be elected president. We know Nixon from previously as Eisenhower's vice president, and then losing against JFK in 1960. Well, he's back, and he becomes the Republican nominee and president in 1969. He and his Secretary of State have a withdrawal strategy from Vietnam called Vietnamization. Right? Vietnamization meaning to withdraw with honor. We're not just going to pull our troops out of Vietnam, because that would unjustify the fact that we were there. We want to make sure that the American public doesn't feel that it was a waste of time, because Nixon still has a silent majority that follows him, his base, his people that got him elected, and many of that silent majority still were in favor of some of the U.S. policies in Vietnam. So to withdraw immediately would be a huge mistake. So Nixon comes up with this policy of Vietnamization. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, is going to work with North Vietnam, a gentleman by the name of Le Duc Thao, who becomes the policymaker of North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh does die in 1969. So Nixon comes up with this strategy to stop the supplies coming into the Viet Cong, and he believes that by bombing neighboring Laos and Cambodia, specifically Cambodia, that this would help the South by not allowing weapons coming in from the North. And what this does is it creates a lot of anger, because Nixon does not have congressional approval to bomb Cambodia. He just orders it. And this causes massive protests in the United States, and creates a lot of chaos in the country of Cambodia, to the point where there's going to be a coup in Cambodia, and one of the most horrible leaders in the 20th century rises to power. One of the protests that symbolize American anger happened at Kent State in Ohio. This is where 4 students are going to be killed by National Guardsmen for protesting against Cambodia. And these National Guardsmen fired on a group of students at Kent State and wind up killing 4. All right. Nixon in 1969 to 1970 is going to continue to try to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiation table by pretty much the strategy that was used throughout through 65 and 68 with those high aerial assaults and bombings. But it was the amount of bombs that Nixon used that kind of gives him a bad rap. It was a tremendous amount of bombs, and he only stops on Christmas, hence the name Christmas bombs. Christmas bombing. By January of 1973, the North begin to come to the negotiation table, and we begin to introduce our policy of withdrawal. And basically, Henry Kissinger negotiates with the North that if they allow the South, meaning the North allows the South the right to choose their own government, we will pull out of Vietnam as long as there's no further invasions. The North agree, and by 1973, the United States begins this withdrawal. All right. The United States Secretary of State justifies, Henry Kissinger justifies the accords, saying that they were satisfactory. So by 1973, the last U.S. forces leave Vietnam. The North Vietnamese do overrun the South 2 years later, so they did not uphold their agreement. There's members of the United States members evacuating the embassy building in the South, and that was the last of the U.S. leaving Vietnam in 1975. The North Vietnamese in 1975 marched into the South, and they declare Saigon, which was the former capital, Ho Chi Minh City. I'd mentioned before that when Nixon had bombed Cambodia, this helped the communist rebels known as the Khmer Rouge rise to power, and their leader was Pol Pot. Pol Pot was an extremist. He killed any intellectuals in that country, anybody that he believed could oppose his coup. And Cambodia was renamed the Killing Fields because of the massive amount of deaths that were there under the regime of Pol Pot. So Pol Pot is going to be ousted from power eventually, but at the expense of millions of deaths. If you feel like really getting into this, Mr. Bloom does a great job covering the Khmer Rouge in his Holocaust and Genocide class. So if you want to further your knowledge on that, that'd be a good way to do it. And 1968, the Vietnamese ousted the Khmer Rouge. They had cells throughout the 80s and 90s until the death of Pol Pot in 1998. And the results of the Vietnam War, there were 58,000 American deaths, South Vietnamese and Viet Cong, over 900,000. 304,000 Americans wounded, over 10,000 Americans MIA or prisoners of war. The U.S. finally recognizes the communist government in 1989, and both Laos and Cambodia fall to communism. So the domino theory, where the United States was trying to prevent one country falling, actually you're going to see 3 countries fall to communism. So I hope you guys enjoyed the notes. I hope to talk to you soon, and log into office hours if you have any questions. Take care.